Hi, good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to everyone this evening. It gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to the second ORF Kalpana Chawla Annual Space Policy Dialogue. We've been working for about 6 months, this conference, and I can't believe that we are actually into the starting gate. So it feels great. This conference, in a sense, includes many of the people that we have been engaged with over the last several years. But we also try to bring in an eclectic mix of not just academics, but also those who work on policy issues from the industry side, as well as various governments, in a sense. So before I move on to my welcoming duty, I want to kind of talk a few words, share a few words about ORF itself for the benefit of all my new friends here. ORF, we are a public policy think tank. We are a quarter-century old, and we work on many issues of public policy, everything from economic policy to urban planning to national security and foreign policy. We are a non-partisan think tank, and our objective is to generate debate on all these various issues in the public policy domain. We at ORF have been focusing on various aspects of security. We have earlier worked on chemical, biological, radiological security, nuclear security, arms trade treaty, to name a few. On space as well, we worked on and organized a major conference in 2011, and we had partnered with CIPRI and Secure World Foundation, one of our initiative partners for this conference as well. But we also realized there needs to be more regular, periodic conversations on the space policy aspects, and therefore we have taken this initiative. We launched it last year on a much smaller scale, but it has grown so much since the time we began our journey in 2015 March, to the point where we actually had to shift the day sessions to India Habitat Center. We had to move out of ORF for sure because of the volume or the response that we have got in terms of the participation, both as speakers as well as participants to this event. Clearly, outer space has become part of our lives. However, I'm not too sure that we appreciate it as all that much. I want to relate to you something that happened in the US context, but I can see this very well playing out in the Indian context as well as in many other countries. So there was this technocrat, a member from the technocrat community, who went to talk to a politician, and he said, we need a new weather satellite. The politician turned around and said, we already have weather channel. Do we need a space satellite, another space weather satellite? I think that's the kind of general understanding among the politicians. I think there are a handful of people within India or even in many other countries that can actually relate to space policy and talk about or look at the need to have an space policy in place. But I think that's the job then for the think tankers. It gives us an opportunity to tap on this particular opportunity, start these policy conversations involving all the different stakeholders. Because today the biggest problem that I see in many countries is that we work in silos. And so the idea with our policy initiative, this dialogue, is to bring in all the different stakeholders under one roof and debate on all the different policy issues pertaining to outer space. Thus, this is going to be an open platform, including folks from the security, military, government, scientists, technocrats, private sector, and all the commercial players. Now, let me come to the main duty of this evening. I'm very happy to welcome each one of you to the second annual ORF Kalpana Chawla Annual Space Policy Dialogue. Many of you have traveled long distances, and a special thank you to each one of you. I'm also thankful to those of you who have come on your own, bearing the expenses of your travel and all the hotel and all the other expenses, in a sense. I owe a special thanks to all of them. You have been easy on us, and I think that's been very kind of you. But most of all, I'm happy to welcome this evening Dr. Shashi Tharoor and Dr. V.K. Saraswat, who have come to deliver a special address and an inaugural address this evening. Dr. Tharoor launched the first dialogue that we had in March 2015, and I must say that he has been greatly lucky for us. He has been also very indulgent with us, and so a very special thank you, sir. He's no stranger to any of you and doesn't need any introduction, but let me quickly say a few words nevertheless. Dr. Tharoor is a second-term Lok Sabha Member of Parliament, representing the Thiruvananthapuram constituency. He's also the chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs. Previously, he served as the Minister of State for Human Resource Development, as well as the Minister of State for External Affairs. During his 3-decade-long career, he also, at the United Nations, he also served as Under-Secretary General under Kofi Annan's leadership of the organization. He's also works a lot on and writes on the global governance aspect. He's the Dean of the ORF Asian Forum for Global Governance, so he's an integral part of the ORF family in that sense. He's authored several books, and I'm not going to read out the list, but some of the prominent ones include Reasons of State, India from Midnight to the Millennium, Nehru, The Invention of India. I'm going to stop here, but let me welcome Dr. Tharoor first to do the inaugural address, please.
Thank you, Rajeshwari, and good evening to everyone here. I see some very distinguished figures in the audience, and it's great to see you all this evening, this vanguard group of scientists, entrepreneurs, policymakers, diplomats, and to do so in memory of Kalpana Chawla and to honor and carry on the cause for which she gave her life. I was little over a year old when the world marveled at the success of Sputnik 1, the first satellite to exit and orbit our planet. As I grew into my teens, of course, the space race gathered more momentum, with its crowning moment being, of course, Neil Armstrong's landing on the moon. I still remember sitting at a traffic light in Calcutta, and those days we used to have afternoon papers as well, and so a young boy, sort of great excitement going around saying, a man has landed on the moon. At the time, the whole idea of space exploration seemed to many to be an expensive game for the Cold War superpowers alone to play, just the US and the USSR to compete for the glamour of dominating the heavens. But Nehruji, of course, disagreed with this notion. He believed that science is not only an individual search for truth, quote unquote, but rather something that could be infinitely more than that if it worked for the community. And that's Nehru's exact phrase. His vision and wisdom led him to launch India on a decades-long journey that has placed us today amongst the world's top space powers. Indeed, today, space exploration and research is far from concentrated between two superpowers as in the bad old days. It's a collective global endeavor that is necessary for economic development. As you know, our own ISRO, well represented today, has made critical advancements over recent years. The ISRO has certainly achieved vital progress in the fields of remote sensing, meteorology, agriculture, irrigation planning, disaster management, and global positioning and navigation systems. So all the community benefits that Nehruji had spoken about. Bhuvan, the ISRO's geographical information system, plays a critical role in urban planning, industrialization, resources management, and sustainable development. These space technologies have helped us discover solutions literally out of this world to our earthly problems. But alongside these advancements are a host of challenges. There is an imminent, perhaps ongoing arms race in space. Military and security-oriented applications have replaced the predominantly exploratory ventures of decades past. There has been an exciting expansion of non-state actors involved in space technology. In the West, even educational institutions have launched small satellites. Other players like SpaceX and Virgin Galactic and a number of the attendees of this conference each offers exciting opportunities. What drives the exciting growth in space exploration in the public and private sectors? Economic development has provided a greater resource pool for public investment in space programs. Advancements in traditional industrial technologies have helped enhance the quality and sophistication of space technology. And now as consumers see opportunity to enjoy the benefits of space research directly, there are market pressures as well driving investment into the development of profitable space technologies. But the expansion of such private actors in space exploration and research is a double-edged sword. This leads us to the second challenge. On the road leading to outer space, we might experience bumper-to-bumper traffic. We will need to address overcrowding of man-made satellites in space, attend to space debris, and address access problems caused by overcrowding. This will require us to craft global agreements on outer space negotiations and outer space regulations. A crowded field also requires renewed attention to spectrum allocation, which, given current growth trends, will invariably become a serious issue. Unfortunately, not all space activity will be legitimate, and we will see an inevitable rise of illegitimate, borderline criminal activity. Countries that pursue civil space technologies could always divert them for military purposes. There could be deliberate attempts to damage or destroy other nations' space assets, such as satellites, as competition mounts. Nation-states generally recognize the existence of these threats and challenges in this largely unregulated sector. So the challenge is truly coming to a global consensus amongst nation-states on a policy to explore and tap into space. The current lack of consensus among the major spacefaring states, if one can use that word, is particularly troublesome. And their disagreements have, for years, hindered the development of an effective space regime. Cooperation is between small numbers of countries rather than part of the larger global community, and this can obviously exacerbate existing global anxieties. Now, of course, we know there are unique challenges to regulating space. For instance, unlike the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the last vestige of apartheid in international law, I often say, we cannot deny space technology to interested states and other parties. If they have the resources and the know-how, they will likely promote their space programs regardless of the demands of existing spacefaring countries. It should be. Regulation then depends to a great extent on regulating technology. If the technology is protected and used with responsibility, with current space powers leading by example, we could have somewhere to begin. States that divert civil space technology for military purposes must similarly be held accountable and monitored, no matter how challenging or daunting this prospect. After all, responsibility always rests heaviest on the shoulders of the pioneers, whose every lapse and error could alter the course of history. International instruments fall short of a meaningful regulatory framework. The Outer Space Treaty, while a generally good measure, has a number of weaknesses. It regulates the non-placement of weapons of mass destruction, though it ignores conventional weapons that could be used to damage other states' satellites. In certain areas, on the other hand, the Outer Space Treaty has become too expansive in its scope. There is a need for greater definitional clarity. What exactly are space weapons? How do you define the defensive use of outer space, or the peaceful use of outer space? In fact, even the definition of an astronaut is not clear, its typical meaning being personnel of a spacecraft, irrespective of whether this person is a weapons expert, a space tourist on a Virgin Galactic, or George Clooney in the movie Gravity. In fact, my son has just published a book of short stories titled Swimmer Amongst the Stars. And Swimmer Among the Stars is actually the phrase used by a character in one of the stories, the last speaker of a dying language, in her language, for an astronaut. So there you go. We're all potentially swimmers among the stars, I suppose, today. Now, the draft treaty on the prevention of placement of weapons in outer space and of the threat or use of force against outer space objects, PPWT I think it's called, originally proposed in 2008 and then reintroduced in 2014 by Russia and China, talks about the placement of weapons in space. Again, a number of ambiguities exist. Ground-based weapons that are more likely and capable of targeting space assets of rivals are generally left unregulated, leading to an overemphasis on weapons in outer space. The PPWT also ignores the consequences of overcrowding, including mounting space debris. Indeed, Ecuador's only satellite collided with debris in 2013 with devastating consequences. These concerns have caused PPWT to receive generally limited support. The EU's Code of Conduct for Outer Space Activities 2010 is, on the other hand, a pretty good transparency and confidence building measure. However, this too ran into trouble with a lot of states due to problems with the unilateral manner in which the EU produced the code. Though we must give credit to those in the EU for their outreach efforts since 2010. So they did the code unilaterally, but then they have gone out of their way to explain it. They held seminars to gauge regional responses, 3 rounds of open-ended consultations, and a round of negotiations in New York last year. The progress will reveal itself in the coming years, but larger geopolitical forces, such as Russia's strategic position amidst the crisis in Ukraine, have perhaps forced some to harden their positions, and consensus so far seems elusive. So how do we endure this long and difficult road to a global consensus on space? For many countries, a legally binding mechanism is the most desirable option. But political realities have proven difficult to overcome. Treaty making was relatively easier in the 20th century. In the 1950s and 60s, arrangements were negotiated between 2 great powers, essentially, and everybody else kind of came along. In the 21st century, the diffusion of power, the diffusion of technology, and the involvement of both state and non-state actors has led to additional complications. But there are things we can do to move forward. We can build political consensus around the regulation of technologies and their use. Transparency and confidence-building measures and the UN group of government experts can instill confidence and establish norms of responsible behavior, even as we work towards making such norms legally binding with effective controls to ensure compliance. TCBMs are important risk reduction measures and prove the basis for greater understanding and dialogue among states. This framework can serve as a foundation for meaningful international cooperation. It's an intermediate step, but a step forward nonetheless. India, of course, must be actively involved in these processes. We must support the institutionalization of the best practices that lead to legal measures, and I have long been an advocate, both inside and outside Parliament, of greater Indian involvement and in playing a proactive role. I've long argued that India has a responsibility and must exercise a responsibility in the management of the global commons, from cyberspace to, of course, outer space. Today, anyway, space is democratic. The need of the hour, we can all agree, is an outer space regime, one that reflects and complements our international regime here on Earth. The discussions that you have here today and tomorrow, does it go on beyond tomorrow? Yeah. The day after tomorrow as well, will, I hope, help us bound forward towards such a global consensus to ensure that space policy is not a point of contention, but rather an exercise in diplomacy and mutual understanding. You know, we discovered the Earth through conflict, I'm afraid, through war, through huge amounts of destruction. Let us discover space through cooperation and agreed regulation. Thank you very much. Have a very good conference. Jai Hind.
Good evening, friends, and thanks, Rajeshwari. It's a pleasure to be among all of you, such esteemed people with lots of experience in handling policy issues, development, and running the governments. I think Mr. Tharoor has given us a great coverage of the entire problem of the space security or sustainability. From the early days, when probably none of us was born, when the Interplanetary Society was formed, till 1957 and today, the journey to the space has really matured in its entirety. And today, if I must say that probably the center of gravity of the human civilization is slowly tending to be dependent on the space technologies, space assets. And what we are looking at today in terms of the change which is taking place on our dependence on the space assets for the civil and military applications, whether it is communication, navigation, whether it is transmission, it is internet, telephone, you know all of them. Scientific, actually the whole thing started with scientific exploration and understanding of the space. But as the human mind is, the technology is always for creating comforts, and those comforts, those explorations have led to all this what we are enjoying today in terms of the speed, in terms of mobility, in terms of communication and all that. Now imagine that all that is denied. What will be its impact? Its impact on economy, its impact on your capability for tactical and strategic readiness. Everywhere you have a problem. And as we are also exploring more and more planets, like the India's space program itself has now done Chandrayaan, it has done the Mars mission, and the other countries have also done, and we also know that there are huge resources available on some of these planets which will certainly help tide over the problems which we have on the Earth in terms of resources. For example, the helium availability on the moon. So there is going to be a race for or competition for reaching over there and exercising your rights. Are we ready for it? Are we doing the right thing? Are we ready for it? In addition to that, we have the adverse impact of large number of these activities which are taking place, because today there is certainly a clamor for finding space for your own satellites. The crowded orbits, the large huge debris which is present there, and also whether you like, certainly as we say that the space should be only for peaceful purpose, but militarization of the space has already taken place. I think we should not shy away from the fact that most of the militaries today in the world are using their space assets for improving their efficacy in the tactical and the strategic warfare domain. While we have all signed the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, so many nations, 129 and so on and so forth, but you will realize that the type of gaps which are existing in that treaty have enabled people to get ready for worse situations for exploitation of the space. We all say that weaponization of the space should not take place, we should all work towards it. But are we really doing the similar steps for that? Have the nations not tested anti-satellite weapons? The China has done, the US has done, despite the fact that we are having a dialogue on how to improve the security of the space by our treaties and so on and so forth. That means there is a certain amount of deliberate intention, as it has happened in the past in many of the other cases. Say for example in the nuclear treaties, where there was, during till about 1964, there have been a continuous testing of the nuclear weapons by the countries who were deeply involved in it, and suddenly you put a barrier and say that all nations now henceforth will have to follow the NPT and CTBT and FMBT and so on and so forth. Are you not seeing that kind of a scenario emerging? Kindly look at this. And on top of that, in spite of all these treaties happening, what has happened? You have seen the collision of the Iridium. You have seen the US orbital debris which is there floating into the space. You have seen the Chinese satellite when it was destroyed by the ASAT, almost more than 150,000 pieces of the debris floating around. Now all this is also a great threat as far as the peaceful satellites which are existing today. Are our treaties taking care of all that? Certainly we will have to give a bigger thinking as far as these things are concerned. The major thing which is going to happen is, because of the overcrowding of these orbits, because of the large number of nations demanding more and more number of nations getting the capability to not only get it launched but also launch and get their own satellites for different applications, you have a clamor for the spectrum. And while the agency is available today to take care of the spectrum allocation, orbit allocation in terms of ITUs and so on, but nobody is really looking at what kind of interferences are likely to take place. And any interference, the RF interference that can take place, can also be incidental or it could be intentional. Now, if it is intentional, then it falls into the category of a deliberate attempt to deny the space services to the nation to which it belongs. So it falls in the category of what we call as intended denial of space. If you take the same case for all the assets which you are using today, all of you know how easy it is to now deny a GPS installation, how you can really jam a GPS. And now we have the military asking for the space in all nations, where C4ISR network is completely space dependent, where you have satellites doing all functions for communication, navigation, alint, and identifying all kinds of things, including jamming and so on. Then you have issues. How do you say that while the Outer Space Treaty says that we should not put any of the weapons in space, a laser weapon, is it considered to be in the same category? When America started talking of SDI in the early 80s, and we started bringing down that yes, there is a possibility of beaming a laser beam which can destroy either objects on the earth or within the space onto the satellites of the other nations, then where does it come as far as the treaty is concerned? So we have this dual use business and also militarization already taking place in this particular segment. Now, that is, if that is happening, crowding is taking place, congestion is taking place, all this is a great challenge as far as the space security is concerned. And the military purpose is also taking a different dimension. Because any nation which has got today the capability to launch ICBMs, long-range missiles, any nation which has been able to launch, say, a satellite into either a LEO or a GEO or whatever that other orbit, certainly develops capability to have either a ground-based interceptor for killing the satellite, or satellites which can also carry weapons on board. So this is a situation which is emerging. To eliminate that kind of a thing, today there is a new concept which is coming, and for which DARPA did the great work, because they said let's distribute this. So that they started talking of what is called the 6S program, in which you go for 6F, that is what they call as the flexible and all that. I'm not able to remember all the words, but basically the idea is to distribute it, small satellites doing different functions, and those functions will give you also that no, this is not doing this, this is not doing this. So these are ways and means of defeating the basic purpose of these treaties, and most of these treaties are purely with respect to what we call as sort of, okay, we have ratified it, but there's no punishment available. There's no possibility of one nation saying that, okay, you have done this, please now that's wrong or something. Now all this certainly requires a great attention as far as when you look at the treaties. I'm also looking at the capabilities which are emerging in various segments. For example, all the BMD based systems, when we have Russia as the BMD capability, now China getting the BMD capability, we have US as the BMD capability. Obviously, this is getting translated into the asset capability. So that is one major segment which is happening. Then you have the large number of anti-satellite weapons which are likely to be there as far as the part of the satellite is concerned. It could be laser-based weapon, or it could be electromagnetic pulse weapon, or it could be a weapon which is purely in terms of spoofing or jamming a satellite using another satellite. So now the duality is going to come in this. You may say that no, this is my alien satellite basically for peaceful purpose, for aiding my ground forces, but no, it could be for anything else. So this is a major segment which is happening, and today if you are going to look at the future satellites, where what is happening on the communication segment, where your internet router is going to sit on the satellites tomorrow, where digital channelizer is going to sit on the satellite. So what all functions they can do with respect to disabling the other satellite, besides of course the basic function of giving you larger bandwidth as far as the system is concerned, is going to be a major problem. While there is some identification of the various treaties which Mr. Tharoor was mentioning today, that we have by virtue of, for example, the transparency and confidence building measures treaty, which says that everybody should declare what kind of space assets they are going to plan and what they are doing it. Even they should be allowed to give visits to the voluntary people, they should be able to, you know, all kinds of things. But ultimately, if we are going to do that, for that purpose, there is no means by which you can say, no, yes, you are not supposed to do this, you have done this. So these small satellites which are coming today is going to be a major issue, because while the big satellites you are able to say, but the smaller satellites like the nano satellites or mini satellites or pico satellites, they will be in a position to do all those functions. Today, even the spectrum allocation for the mini satellites and nano satellites and micro satellites is a big issue. Who is going to do it? Like you are having the same case in the case of UAVs while across. While the civil aviation and the other departments are taking care of the paths as far as the aerial paths are concerned, but the UAV and all, we still are not in a position to do that. So we need to do a great thinking when these smaller satellites come into operation. They will be flying in formations, they will be for a shorter duration, they will be quick to launch, and they will be low cost. The real issue is going to be that they are going to leave many more debris and much more problem as far as the systems are concerned. So the activities as far as the world is concerned have to re-look at all the treaties, whether it is the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Space, or the Conference on Disarmament on UN organizations, or the space treaties, or any of the agreements which have been done, including the Moon Treaty of 1984, where people say that we should not exploit the resources available in our planets. We have to really look at whether they are foolproof, whether the space laws are strong enough to make people more responsible as far as the health of the space is concerned. Now, Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee is there, but still the number of debris is continuously increasing, and we have a problem. The Treaty on Prevention of Placement of Weapons in Outer Space, which Mr. Tharoor just mentioned, 2008 to 2016, even today, I don't know how many nations have accepted it. I don't think, I thought, if my knowledge is, it is still in the form of presented, and it needs to be taken. There again, the loopholes are many. Whether it is putting the weapons, then weapons of what kind? Is it nuclear or conventional? We were having dialogue with our armed forces some time back on this issue. What should India do? If you look at the entire scenario of India, we have done exceedingly well, as Mr. Tharoor was mentioning, under Vikram Sarabhai, Dr. Kalam and others, that today we have a very, very strong space program. We have also got a very good missile program, in which we have capabilities for launching missiles, launching satellites, and we can do many things. But in terms of policy making, and in terms of our participation in really steering the policy on the space, I find that we take a laid-back attitude. We are not in a position to actually be even participative in many of the committees. I was just going through the names of the people who were the 15 countries who did that the second treaty, in which I find Sri Lanka was there and India was not there. Now this is a very interesting thing. They said it was done purely on the alphabetical, other than those who are the members of the UN Security Council. Now that shows that although we are a spacefaring nation, we being counted as a power and have a voice in the international platform for making sure that there are sensible role given to, there is a sensible role given to us, and we also make some difference in formulating these policies. I think we are not doing adequate effort. Particularly, I would like to caution at least the crowd here, that we should not do the same mistake what we did when the NPTs and CTBTs and FMBTs were being formed. We missed that particular thing, and 1964 we didn't do what we should have done in terms of testing the nuclear weapons, and what heavy price we had to pay in terms of denials, MTCR, and so on and so forth. You have seen through, I have gone through it myself, and many of my colleagues who are sitting here have seen that day. A day is going to come when the nations will perfect the ASAT, they will perfect the satellite-to-satellite warfare, they will perfect placing the weapons in the space for the safety of their own economies and then there will be a denial regime which will come. Are we prepared for that? Are we going to repeat the same story? Please give a debate. I think this forum should make a debate. And one of the first requirements for us to be prepared to make sure that the technology required to reach that level should be developed in an accelerated manner, whether it is the BMD or the anti-satellite system, or it is the ELINT system, or it is the small satellite system. All these things need to be done. And the distinction between the civilian use of the space and the military use of the space need to be done, because it is a dual use business. I agree, civilian use will continue, but a space command which will make sure that some of these things which are essential for realization and introduction to our own policy, they have to be done. So there is the crying need for us to start bridging this gap and ensuring that there is an order in this. Finally, I would like to mention that we have sufficient strength as far as the country is concerned. Our country is fairly strong technologically in this. The policy initiative is what is needed to make sure that we get ready for that eventuality which may come, which came in the past, and we should not repeat that. As far as the international thing is concerned, I think there is a great requirement for us to tweak these existing policies, bring space laws in a big and regulated manner, and these agencies cannot be only advisory and cannot be only looking at the allotment of debris, allotment of slots, and also the frequency spectrum and so on. These should have the teeth, and unless that teeth comes, unless those laws are formed, I think the sustainability in the space may be a big issue. Thank you very much.